Behind the Bookcase by Mark Steensland. Map. Chapter 1. Arrival. Truth be told, the place looked creepy. Sarah simply couldn't believe that anyone she knew, let alone someone from her very own family, could have anything to do with such a house. Never in her life had she seen such a disaster. The puke green paint was peeling. The lawn, what there was of it, was more brown than green. The flower beds were overrun with weeds. The roof was missing so many shingles it looked like a checkerboard. The driveway was cracked. The steps were sagging. It was awful, made even worse by the fact that they would be celebrating her 12th birthday in it. Even though they had just spent an entire week in the car, driving here from California, Sarah would have gladly turned right around and gone back home. "This is it?" she asked, just to be sure, hoping they had somehow made a mistake, that they had turned onto the wrong street, and this wasn't really Grandma Winnie's house at all. In the front seat, Mom and Dad exchanged a long look, and then Dad said grimly, "Afraid so." Sarah's younger brother, Billy, meanwhile, was wearing a huge smile, which got even bigger when Dad confirmed that this was indeed where they would be spending the summer. "Awesome," Billy said, with a reverence that thoroughly annoyed his sister. What could be awesome about this? "Look at it," he said. "It's like a haunted house." "Billy," Dad said. "Don't say that." "But it is," he insisted. "I'm sure it's just because Grandma wasn't feeling well the last few years. She couldn't keep the house up." "No, honey," Mom said. "It's always been like this. That's why the bullies called me Creepy Carol in school. Now, can you understand why I wanted to leave as soon as I could and get as far away as possible?" Dad tried to put his arm around Mom, but she opened the passenger door and got out of the car quickly. Dad gave Billy one last sour look and then got out with her. "What's wrong with them?" Billy asked. "This is where Mom grew up," Sarah said. "Her mom died in there. Do you think she liked hearing you say it looks haunted?" "Oh," Billy said, his smile suddenly evaporating into a look of timid shame. "I didn't think of that." "Of course not," Sarah snapped. "You don't think of anyone but yourself." "That's not true." "Prove it," Sarah said as she grabbed her backpack and opened her door. The air outside the car was hot and humid. Where they were from in Southern California, it was hot, but not wet like this. Sarah felt as if her mouth were pressed against a damp towel. Billy got out of the car behind her and went over to where their parents were standing. "Sorry, Mom," he said. "I didn't mean it the way it came out." Mom patted Billy on the head. "It's okay," she said with a sniffle. "I understand." She faced the house, shielding her eyes from the sun with one hand. "In a way, I'm glad you like it. At least one of us does." Mom and Dad turned away and started toward the front door. Billy faced his sister and stuck his tongue out at her. She rolled her eyes and joined their parents on the steps. Mom fished in her purse until she found a yellow envelope. After Grandma Winnie had died, Mom had gotten a whole bunch of these yellow envelopes in the mail. When Sarah had asked about them, Mom had explained that they were from lawyers telling her about things she had to do to settle Grandma's affairs. The biggest of all these things was selling the house. That was why they were there. Mom and Dad had decided they would do what they could to fix it up before they sold it. But now that Sarah had actually seen it, she didn't think one summer would be enough time to fix the house. Not unless they rented a bulldozer and just pushed it flat. Mom opened the envelope and took out a key. While Dad held the squeaking screen door, she put the key in the lock, turned it, and pushed the front door open. A gust of cool air came out of the darkness beyond and swept over all of them. To Sarah, it felt like running through the sheets hanging on the laundry line in their backyard at home. In fact, it felt so much like something or someone pushing past her that Sarah gasped a little and stepped back. Was Billy right? Was Grandma's house haunted? Mom and Dad looked at each other again, and Sarah could tell they had felt it, too. Mom just stood there, as if she were frozen in place. "Honey," Dad said, "are you okay?" Mom nodded slowly, then turned around. "Sarah," she said, "you want to go first?" Sarah shook her head quickly. The cool air wasn't the only thing spooking her. Maybe it was because the June sun was so bright, but the darkness beyond the open front door looked as thick as a pool of swirling oil. "I will," Billy shouted, and pushed his way past Sarah and up the steps. Dad couldn't help but laugh as Billy went in. Sarah didn't think it was funny at all. Instead, she was seized with the desire to grab her brother by the shoulder and pull him back. She was afraid that once he touched the darkness, it would suck him in like a whirlpool. She had to stop him, but it was too late. He was gone. A moment later, they heard him inside. "Cool," he said, relieved. Sarah pulled her hand back. Mom waited another moment, then stepped over the threshold. Dad faced Sarah. "Come on, sweetie," he said, smiling that big smile of his, the one that always told her everything was going to be okay. Reassured, she climbed the steps and went inside. Chapter 2. Yellow and Blue. The first thing that hit her was the smell. Sarah had a very strong sense of smell, and right now she wished she didn't. The whole place smelled heavy and thick and dusty, like the old curtains in the school gym. She wanted to say something about it, but decided not to. Mom's feelings were already hurt enough by Billy's haunted house comment. She certainly didn't need Sarah telling her the place stank, even though it did. A sudden swishing sound to her right made Sarah think a giant bird was swooping in to attack her. She was so startled that she screamed and threw her hands up to protect herself. Mom broke into a laugh and rushed toward her, hugging her tightly. "I'm sorry," Mom said. "I didn't mean to scare you. I was just opening the curtains." And now Sarah saw. The curtains in the front windows were made of thick red velvet and hung from heavy brass rings, which sounded like knife blades sliding out of metal sheets when they slid over the rod. "Like this," Dad said as he yanked the other curtain open. The swishing sound wasn't nearly so scary now that Sarah knew what it was. She smiled and shrugged. But then Billy opened his mouth and started singing in a squeaky voice. "Sarah is a scaredy cat. Sarah is a scaredy cat." Sarah broke from Mom's hug and lunged at him, but he got behind Dad before she could reach him. "All right," Dad said. "That's enough of that. Leave each other alone." Sarah sighed and turned away. With the curtains open, the darkness was half gone and she could finally see the room. It was huge, But what really grabbed her was that the walls weren't walls at all. They were bookcases. In more than one of her letters, Grandma Winnie had told Sarah about all the books she owned, but Sarah had never imagined that she had been talking about this many. The bookcases reached all the way to the ceiling, and they were stuffed. There wasn't one empty spot. For someone like Sarah, who loved to read, this was heaven. "Wow," she said quietly. "Bet you can't say that backward," Dad said. Sarah grinned and shook her head. He always said that when she said, "Wow." And he still thought it was funny every time. "Are these all yours now?" Sarah asked. Mom nodded. "So we can keep them?" "Of course we can't keep them," Mom said. "But why not? How would we get them back home?" "In boxes." "And where would we put this many books?" "In my room," Sarah said simply, as if there were no other answer. "You don't have space for the books you already have," Dad said. "Then we could build an addition." "With what money?" "All the money you're going to make from selling this house. That is going to pay for your college." "I hope. At least part of it." "What about my college?" Billy asked. "Yours too," Mom said. "If he lives to see 9, Sarah said under her breath. Mom raised her eyebrows and Sarah turned away as Dad pulled a book from one of the shelves. A cloud of dust came with it. "Besides," he said, coughing and waving his hand in front of his face, "you don't even know if there's anything here you'd want to read." Then he held the book up into the sunlight and read the title. "Phrenology for Beginners," he said with a laugh. "What's that?" "It's the long-forgotten art of telling what kind of person you are by reading the lumps on your head." "What?" Sarah said. "You can do that?" Billy asked. "Of course not," Mom said. "Now let's stop fooling around and get the rest of the curtains and windows open. I think some light and air in here will do a lot of good." "Agreed," Dad said, and shoved the book back onto the shelf. "You two go upstairs and get everything open. Your mom and I will take care of things down here." "Deal," Billy said, and started running. Then he stopped short. "Where are the stairs?" "Over here," Mom called, and Billy started running again. "Wait for me," Sarah said. "Why?" Billy asked. "Are you scared the curtains are going to get you again?" "Billy," Dad said firmly. "Do you need a timeout already?" "No, sir." "I didn't think so." "Come on, Sarah," Billy said, and the two of them dashed to the top of the stairs, then stopped. The hallway in front of them was shaped like a T, with a closed door at the end of each arm. "Which way are you going?" Sarah asked. Billy looked both ways, then pointed to his right. "That way. What about you?" Sarah swallowed thickly. She knew that it was silly to want to stick with Billy, especially because he was her younger brother. But she had always been cautious. That was the way she preferred to think of herself. She wasn't really a scaredy cat, was she? Just because she didn't like the dark? Lots of people were afraid of the dark. It was perfectly normal to be afraid of the dark. Billy was the weird one for wanting to rush in everywhere, especially when he didn't know what he might find. She realized Billy was staring at her, waiting for her answer. She knew that if she went with him, it would just confirm what she was sure he was thinking. So, out of spite more than anything like good sense, she blurted, "I'm going this way," and pointed to the left. "Really?" Billy said. Sarah nodded. You're not afraid? Sarah shook her head. Billy shrugged. Okay, he said. Sarah turned away from him and started toward the door. The light from the window was blocked by the wall, and the door ahead of her was hard to see in the gloom. She squinted, then looked over her shoulder. Billy hadn't moved. He was still standing there, arms crossed, watching her, a smirk on his face. What are you waiting for? She hissed at him. What are you waiting for? Strangely, her irritation gave her a sudden burst of energy, and she spun on her heels, took 2 steps forward, grabbed the knob, twisted it, and pushed the door open. When she turned around to see what Billy had thought of that, she discovered that he was already gone into the other room. Sarah turned back around and stepped through the open door. The room was painted bright yellow. The windows above the bed looked down on the neighbor's house to the east, while another window, in a kind of alcove, looked over the backyard. In addition to the closet and a short built-in bookcase, there was a small door in the wall beneath the sloped roof. Sarah had never seen such a small door before. Curious, she grabbed the knob and pulled. Just inside, she saw a chain attached to a light bulb. She pulled it to turn the light on, then poked her head through the doorway. The little room ceiling slanted down to meet the floor on the far side, about 6 feet away. She saw boxes full of Christmas decorations at the nearer end, but there was still plenty of room. She hoped her mom and dad would say it was okay to play here, but somehow she was sure they wouldn't. Sarah, Billy called. Come here. Look what I found. Sarah pulled the chain again, turning off the light as she stepped out of the room, then closed the door and went down the hallway to the room Billy was in. Other than being painted blue, it was the mirror image of the yellow room, with the same alcove window, built-in bookcase, and little door. As Sarah had suspected, this was what Billy was yelling about. He stood in front of the short door, holding his hands out like the magician they had seen in Las Vegas on their way here. Tada, he said when Sarah came in. I found a secret room. I know, Billy, Sarah said, shaking her head. The other room has one too. Besides, it's not really a secret, is it? Everyone can see the door. She honestly didn't know how she put up with Billy the way she did. He was so annoying, and not just because he called her a scaredy cat. He always thought everything was such a big deal. Whenever she said anything about it, her parents told her she had been the same way when she was younger. But she doubted that. There was no way she had ever been so annoying. She turned to leave just as Dad came in. Hey, he said. Look at that, would you? What is that? A secret room. Sarah rolled her eyes. Mom came in behind him. No, she said. That's only for storage. Don't play in there. Dad poked his head through the door and looked around, then pulled it back out. But why not? It's the perfect size for them. Yeah, Mom, Billy said. No, Mom said. I wasn't allowed to when I was a girl. She looked around the room. I wasn't even allowed in these rooms. Why not? I don't know. Your Grandma Winnie seemed afraid of something up here. Like what? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Not anything real, Dad said. Grandma Winnie was what some people call eccentric. That's a masterpiece of understatement, Mom said. My mother wasn't just eccentric, and you know it. But what was she afraid of? Billy asked. Nothing, Mom said. Even if it was something, it doesn't matter now. Let's just get our stuff from the car and have dinner. We have a lot of work ahead of us tomorrow. The sooner we clean this place up, the sooner we can sell it and go back home. Before anyone could say another word, Mom turned and walked out of the room. Is she okay? Sarah asked. Dad waited until he heard Mom's footsteps on the stairs and then went down on one knee. This is hard for your mother in a lot of ways, ones I think maybe even I don't understand. The couple of times I met Grandma Winnie, she seemed perfectly normal. But your mom has told me some pretty weird stories about the things she used to say and do. She didn't want your mom to leave home. She didn't really want us to get married. But after you kids were born, she suddenly got interested in trying to be a family. And I think that upset your mother even more. I don't understand, Billy said. I do, Sarah said. Dad nodded to her. Let's just do what Mom asks, and maybe we can get back home sooner than we expect. Sarah smiled as Dad hugged her and Billy before getting back to his feet and heading downstairs. The rest of the day went exactly as Mom had said. They unpacked the car and then, because Grandma's house didn't have anything edible in it, Dad picked up a pizza. By the time they changed the sheets on the beds in the upstairs rooms, Sarah was so tired she almost fell asleep brushing her teeth. Chapter 3. The Unfinished Letter. Breakfast the next morning was a strange affair. Mom seemed in a better mood, but Dad seemed cranky. He kept asking Sarah and Billy if they had heard any noises the night before. Like what? Billy asked. Like knocking. Both Sarah and Billy said they hadn't heard a thing, and Mom finally said, I keep telling you, it was just the pipes. They used to do it all the time when I was a kid. But why aren't they knocking now? I don't know, Mom said. Can we please just forget about the pipes and talk about my plan for today? It wasn't the pipes, Dad said under his breath. Maybe it was Grandma, Billy said. The room fell silent. Billy looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Dad. Dad looked at Mom. Very quietly, Mom said, it wasn't Grandma. Yeah, Dad added quickly, I'm sure it was just the pipes. Now let's listen to your Mom's plan. Mom took a deep breath, then explained everyone's assignments. First on the list for Sarah and Billy, clean everything out of the upstairs rooms. Even the beds? Billy asked. Of course not, Mom answered. Not yet, anyway, Dad said, then gave them boxes and tape before sending them upstairs to begin packing. The plan was to have their first garage sale over the weekend, which was only 3 days away, and for that, they needed to get everything downstairs and sort through it. Sarah helped Billy tape a couple of boxes together and then left him in the blue room while she went to the yellow room. As she began working, she realized how sad she was that she would never get to see Grandma Winnie again. Grandma had come for a visit after Billy was born, but Sarah had been only 3 years old, so she couldn't remember anything about it, even with the photos and video her parents had shown her after she asked about it. Grandma had mentioned the visit in a letter to Sarah just over a year before. More letters had followed that first one, and she had often written about how she hoped she could visit again soon, or that Sarah would come to her place. Sarah loved getting these weekly letters from Grandma. How sad it was that there would be no more letters. Even sadder that Sarah and her family were finally here and Grandma Winnie wasn't. And sadder still was the thought that those letters might have been upsetting to her mother. Suddenly, Sarah felt a hand run through her hair and she jumped. "Billy," she shouted and turned around, expecting to find her brother standing behind her, laughing at his practical joke. But there was no one there. A cold knot of fear formed in her stomach. "What?" Billy called to her from the other room. Sarah turned around again, but she really was alone. She stepped to the door and looked across the hall. Billy appeared in the doorway opposite. "Did you call me?" "Yeah," Sarah said, not wanting to say anything about being scared. "I was just wondering how it was going over there." "Good," Billy said. Sarah gave him a thumbs up and then went back into the yellow room. Something was wrong. The chair in front of the strange-looking dresser in the corner had been moved. She was sure that just a minute earlier it had been pushed all the way against the front of the dresser. Now it was at an angle, as if someone had pulled it out for her to sit in. Sarah felt the knot in her stomach tighten. She tried to remind herself what her father had told her about fear. "The only way to overcome something you're scared of," he always said, "is to face it head-on." But this seemed ironic to her now. How could she face something that wasn't even there? "You're being silly," she whispered. "There's no such thing as ghosts." Since she had to clean the dresser out anyway, she moved forward slowly, sat down in the chair, and opened the first drawer. Expecting clothes, she was surprised to find stacks of paper and boxes of pencils. She opened the next drawer and found boxes of envelopes and stamps. Then she realized that this wasn't a dresser at all. It was a desk. The top part, what she had thought was a drawer without a handle, flipped down to make a writing surface. Behind that, Sarah found even more pencils and pens, along with tiny metal boxes full of rubber bands and paper clips, all squirreled away in cute little cubby holes. She saw her name on an envelope, and when she pulled it out, a piece of folded paper came with it and floated through the air, moving back and forth as if it were attached to strings and someone was moving it around. After what seemed an impossibly long time, the paper landed on the floor and slid to a stop in front of the short bookcase built into the wall. Sarah got to her feet, walked over to the paper, bent down and picked it up. Even before she unfolded it, she could see writing on it. "My sweet Sarah," the note started out, just like all Grandma's letters did. Sarah scanned the page and then realized the letter was unfinished. The last line on the page stopped in mid-sentence. Sarah sat down on the bed to read the letter more carefully. The opening few lines were all the usual inquiries about how school was going and how the rest of the family was. Then the tone shifted. "I'm worried, my dear girl," it said. "Strange things are happening behind the bookcase. I can feel it. And without someone to take over my job watching the doors, I don't know what sort of havoc will come of it. You absolutely must come for a visit as soon as possible. I can't think of anyone else to trust. Never mind what your mother says. You must keep asking until she agrees. I simply don't know how much, and that was it." Sarah frowned. Grandma Winnie had never sounded like this in one of her letters. What doors was she talking about? Then she looked at the top of the page and saw that it was dated May 3rd. That was right around the time Grandma Winnie had died. Was this her last letter? Had she died writing it? Suddenly, Sarah didn't feel so good. She threw the letter back into the desk as if it were on fire, then slammed the top shut. When she turned around, there was a huge man standing in the doorway. Sarah screamed. Chapter 4. In the basement. "Whoa," Dad said. "It's just me." Sarah caught her breath, relieved that the giant man in the doorway was just her dad. "Don't do that," she shouted. "What did he do?" Billy asked. "I don't know," Dad said. "And she's not even a teenager." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Did you want something?" she asked. Dad nodded. "We've got a load of stuff from the downstairs bedrooms that needs to be moved into the basement." "Cool," Billy said. "I've been wanting to go down there." "Me too," Sarah said. Their house in California didn't have a basement, and she was eager to see what one was like. "Well, good on that," Dad said, and took them downstairs. He gave each of them a box from the stack outside the master bedroom, then took them through the kitchen and down another set of stairs into the basement. Sarah was surprised to see that it was already crowded with boxes and furniture. "Okay, you two," Dad said. "We need to find a place to put these boxes so we can still get through." "What is all this stuff?" Sarah asked as she moved forward slowly. "All this stuff belonged to your mother's Aunt Adeline," Dad said. "Mom says Grandma Winnie inherited it from her after she died and just never did anything with it." Sarah shook her head and kept walking, Billy close behind her. They wound their way between walls made of furniture and boxes. Past the washer and dryer, they came to a squat black machine with thick pipes shooting out of it in every direction. "Hey, Dad," Billy said. "What is that thing?" Dad appeared behind them and squinted at it. "The boiler, I think." "What does it do?" "During the winter, hot water from there goes upstairs to those radiators in every room. That's how you keep the house warm." Sarah continued forward, edging her way around the big black boiler. The space beyond it was dark, and while she hesitated, Billy plunged forward. She thought she could see a door in the far wall, and she wondered where it went. "Hey, Dad," Billy said. "Where does this door go?" "What door?" Dad asked, pushing his way along the narrow path between the furniture and boxes. "That one," Sarah said, pointing. Dad found the chain for the overhead light and pulled it. The bright bulb threw shadows from the boiler across the walls like giant spiders, but they could see the door now. Dad frowned. He said. "That's weird." "What is?" He stared at the ceiling. "That door looks like it's beyond the foundation of the house." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "Usually basements only go right under a house. Whatever is past that door looks like it goes farther out than it should. And from the looks of that lock, Grandma Winnie didn't want anyone to know what was in there." Sarah knew what he meant. The lock was so big and old it looked like something from a fairy tale, like the kind of lock an evil queen would keep on her dungeon doors. "I'll tell you what's behind that door," Mom said, and everyone turned around. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, a box in her hand. She set the box down and walked toward them slowly. It's a place called Penumbra. Dad laughed. Penumhu, he said. Billy thought this was very funny and he laughed extra hard. Don't laugh, Mom said. Penumbra is where the souls of the dead go to sleep. Billy stopped laughing abruptly, as if someone had hit his off switch. You're kidding, right? Of course she's kidding, Dad said. But I don't think it's very funny. I don't either, Mom said. But that's what Grandma Winnie used to tell me. Really? Mom nodded. I had forgotten about it, she said. She used to tell me all kinds of stories. Stuff she read in those books upstairs, I'm sure. Like how this house was full of secrets and doors to places with names I can't even remember now. Things she said that I couldn't understand then, but that I would someday. Things behind the bookcases, too? Sarah asked. Yes, Mom said. How did you know that? One of her letters. I don't remember that. Sarah shook her head. One she didn't send. You're not making any sense. I think that runs in the family, Dad said, and Mom raised her eyebrows at him. Sarah explained about finding the unfinished letter upstairs, and both Mom and Dad shook their heads. Now, that sounds like something more than just eccentric, Dad said. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Like Grandma was crazy or something? Maybe, Mom said. The stories she used to tell certainly were. And sometimes I think she believed them a bit too much. So that's not really Carumba back there? Billy asked. Mom laughed. Penumbra, she said. And no, Dad put in quickly, there aren't any sleeping dead souls back there. Oh, Billy said with great disappointment. Sarah rolled her eyes. So what is back there? Mom shrugged. We'll find out soon enough, Dad said. What do you mean? It means that if we can't find the key to that lock, I'll have to go to the hardware store and get some bolt cutters. What are those? Sarah asked. Like big scissors. Only for locks. Why would we need those? Mom asked. We can't sell a house with a locked door in it, Dad said. Any realtor is going to ask that it be opened anyway, so let's get it over with. What are you worried about? Mom sucked in a deep breath. I don't know. I guess it's just my childhood coming back up on me. My mother really used to scare me with all those stories. That explains a lot, Dad said, then playfully nudged Mom in the side and pulled her toward the stairs. All right, he said. Let's have some lunch. I'm starved. Chapter 5. The bookcase moves. All during lunch, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what Mom had said about that door in the basement. About how Grandma had told her this house was full of secrets. She knew that it was silly. They had to be stories. But if they were just stories, why had that unfinished letter sounded so serious? Standing now in the doorway of the yellow room, Sarah knew there was only one way to find out. Afraid that the rest of her family might think she was losing her grip on reality the way they thought Grandma Winnie had, she closed the door and then walked to the bookcase. It was small, maybe 4 feet high by 2 or 3 feet wide, about the same size as the little door to the storage area. Quickly, she took the books off the shelves and put them into empty boxes. This is silly, she whispered, but she couldn't help herself. She had to know. She took a deep breath and then, carefully, she put one hand on the middle shelf and pulled. Nothing happened. She examined the edges of the bookcase, where the molding met the wall, but it seemed as solid as could be. She knelt down and felt along the bottom edge. Nothing. With her hands still on the middle shelf, she pushed herself to her feet. As she did, she heard something snap. She pulled her hand away fast, worried that she had broken the shelf. She knelt again and looked, but couldn't see any place where it was broken. She got to her feet and pushed, more gently this time. She heard the snap again and now saw that the top edge of the bookcase was coming away from the wall. She put her hand above the space and felt cool air rushing out. Slipping her fingers into the crack, she pulled a little bit, and to her surprise, the whole bookcase started to slide out of the wall. "No way," Sarah whispered, suddenly overcome with excitement. She almost called Mom to come quickly and see that Grandma had been telling the truth, but she stopped herself. Not yet, she thought. Not until I get a chance to see what this is all about. Sarah grabbed the middle shelf like a handle and pulled straight out. The bookcase came out of the wall, scraping over the floor, and Sarah sat down with a loud thump. "What's going on up there?" Mom yelled from downstairs. "Are you okay?" "Yes," Sarah yelled back. "I just dropped a box." Sarah stood quickly and listened to make sure Mom wasn't coming upstairs. Then she pulled the bookcase out just a bit more. The space behind it was completely dark, and the cool air that rushed out over her face felt good in the summer heat. Sarah still couldn't believe it. This was like something from one of the mysteries she liked to read so much. She had her dad to thank for that. He also liked to read mysteries. He'd started when he was a kid with books about the Hardy Boys and the Three Investigators. When Sarah had been Billy's age, her dad had read those same books to her. She had become so obsessed with being a detective that her parents had given her a whole collection of investigation gear on her last birthday. Quickly, she went to her backpack and dug around inside until she found the detective stuff: walkie-talkies, a magnifying glass, an invisible ink pen, and a flashlight. When she found the flashlight, she turned it on and went back to the bookcase. She shined the light into the dark space and saw wooden walls that looked very much like those in the storage room behind the short door. But this room was a real secret room. She was sure even her mom didn't know about it. If she had, she would have told Sarah and Billy about it just to tell them to stay out. Maybe that was why Grandma Winnie hadn't let Mom in these rooms when she was a kid. Sarah decided she would explore this secret room later, and then maybe, just maybe, she would tell her Mom and Dad about it, depending on what she found. She switched off the flashlight and set it on the floor. Then she lined up the bookcase and used her feet to push it back into the wall. When it was all the way in, she stood up and ran her fingers around the edges. It was just like before. No one would be able to tell it had ever been out of the wall. Chapter 6. Behind the Bookcase. After dinner, Sarah took a shower and dressed in her pajamas. She brushed her teeth, then went into the yellow room. She saw that her bedtime was still half an hour away, but she went ahead and got into bed. This proved to be a mistake. When Mom came in to check on her, she frowned. "You're not going to bed already, are you?" she asked. "I'm tired," Sarah said. "Okay," Mom said. but you sure don't seem tired. Tell you the truth, you seem just as energetic as you were on Christmas morning. I'm just so excited about this place. Since when? I don't know. Since now. I'm actually having a lot of fun. You're having fun cleaning? Mom's frown deepened as she felt Sarah's forehead. Are you sure you aren't sick? Sarah laughed. Yes, I'm sure. Okay, Mom said, and kissed her. Good night, then. Good night. Mom switched on the nightlight, switched off the lamp, and then went out the door. As she was pulling it shut, she said, "Tell me when to stop." You can close it all the way, Sarah said. Mom poked her head back inside. Are you sure? Sarah usually liked to have the door open a little bit. Tonight, however, she needed it closed if she was going to explore the secret room and not get caught. She nodded. I'm sure. Okay, Mom said, and closed the door all the way. Sarah waited, listening. A few minutes later, she heard Dad put Billy in bed and say good night to him. Then she heard her parents switch off the light in the hallway and go downstairs. She waited for what seemed like an hour, then carefully pushed the covers back and got out of bed. When her feet touched the floor, it creaked and she froze. She was sure that if Mom and Dad heard her creaking around in her room, they would come up to check on her. She knew it would be best if she waited until the middle of the night when everyone was actually asleep, but she couldn't. She was simply too excited. She thought she could hear them talking, but then she heard singing and she realized they were watching TV. Sarah smiled. With the TV on, they wouldn't be able to hear her if she was careful and didn't creak too much. She put on her slippers, then got down on her knees and lifted the bed skirt. She had put her detective stuff in a box under the bed that afternoon in preparation for this moment. Now she pulled the gear out and took it with her to the bookcase. Even more carefully than she had earlier, she grabbed the middle shelf and slid the bookcase out of the wall. This time, she kept pulling until there was enough space for her to fit behind it. She picked up the flashlight, turned it on, and shined it into the darkness. As she crouched in the entrance, fear suddenly fluttered through her stomach and her mouth went dry. The cool air that had felt so good on her face earlier chilled her now, and she shivered. She was beginning to think this wasn't such a good idea. What if there were spiders? Worse, what if there were rats? Sarah leaned back. Maybe she should just wait until tomorrow morning. No, she whispered. She knew she would never be able to wait. If she didn't go in now, she wouldn't be able to sleep. She shined the flashlight across the walls again. She saw clusters of spider webs, but no spiders. When she shined the flashlight straight ahead, she couldn't see a wall on the far side. She would have to go in if she wanted to find out how big the room was. She inched forward and pointed the flashlight straight up. The ceiling was far away, much farther than in the storage closet. She could actually stand up in this room. She took a deep breath, went all the way through the entrance, and stood up. She rubbed her shoulders, trying to warm up. She thought about going back for a sweater, but then decided to explore a little bit more first. She shined the flashlight across the floor and saw that it was unfinished. Splinters stuck up in a few places, so she was glad she was wearing her slippers. She took another few steps, using the flashlight to check the ceiling and walls for spiders or webs. With her head tilted back, she didn't see the hole in the floor. Her foot landed on nothing but air, and she fell forward with a yelp, tumbling through the darkness. Chapter 7. In the Forest of Shadows. Sarah was asleep and didn't want to wake up, but someone kept tapping her on the shoulder. And they weren't being very nice about it either. In fact, it felt like they were hitting her with their fist. All right, she said as she opened her eyes and rolled over. Her head hurt, and when she sat up, she felt dizzy. For a moment, she thought she saw a giant hand standing in front of her. She bowed her head, rubbing her eyes. She thought that when she opened them again, she would see her mother instead of the giant hand, but the hand was still there. Sarah gulped. It was the biggest hand she'd ever seen, at least as tall as her dad. Instead of an arm below the wrist, however, this hand had a pair of normal-sized legs with normal-sized feet. An eye as big as a dinner plate blinked at her from the center of the palm. She suddenly realized that if the hand wanted to, it could make a fist and squash her like a bug. She backed up quickly, her fingers digging into the ground beneath her as she tried to get away. But when the hand just stood there, she stopped, feeling somewhat relieved. She sat still for a long moment, waiting for the hand to say something to her. But it didn't. "Who or what are you?" she asked. The eye blinked once slowly, but the hand did not answer. And then, all at once, she realized the problem and nearly laughed out loud. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, covering her mouth with her hand, trying to hide her laugh. "I didn't notice you don't have a mouth." The hand didn't have a nose or arms either, for that matter. The eye blinked at her again. Then the hand turned around slowly and the fingers closed on the palm 3 times fast. Now it was Sarah's turn to blink. She scratched her head. "You want me to follow you?" she asked. But the hand just walked away, down a narrow path of black sand between dark trees. As she got to her feet, Sarah rubbed her head. She had been so scared by the hand, and then so relieved it hadn't crushed her that she hadn't had time to really think about what was going on. She looked around and saw that she was surrounded by black trees and black sand. Her first thought was that this must be penumbra, but she didn't see any sleeping people alive or dead, so maybe it wasn't. Mom had said there were other places, too, hidden in the house, places with names she couldn't remember. Maybe this was one of those places. Sarah certainly hoped so. She reached out to touch one of the trees, but her hand went through the trunk, as if it was the shadow of a tree instead of a tree. Behind her, she heard a rustling, like a silk dress rubbing against itself, and when she looked over her shoulder, she saw a stream of silver water flowing between the trees. Mesmerized by the bright water, she stepped toward the stream, her eyes tracing its path to where it spilled down the face of a black mountain rising behind the forest. Just above the treetops, she saw a hole in the side of the mountain and suddenly remembered tumbling through the darkness from the secret room behind her bookcase. She stopped for a moment, thinking this must be a dream. She closed her eyes and rubbed them open, but everything was the same. She peered up at the hole in the side of the mountain. She could barely see it now. It looked more like a shadow than anything else. She heard a loud noise behind her, and when she turned, she saw the hand snapping its fingers and motioning for her to follow it. "I'm coming," she said. "It's just that I've never seen any place like this before." Sarah caught up with the hand, then looked over her shoulder. "I didn't even know a place like this existed, or that there were things like you." The hand looked at her and the eye blinked. "I wish you could tell me where I am." But the hand kept walking. Farther along, the stream flowed close to the path and Sarah stopped. She had never seen water so bright, and she bent down to scoop up a handful. She giggled. It was the lightest stuff she'd ever felt, like cotton candy made of ice water, but it wasn't wet at all. It ran through her fingers quickly, except for a single drop that remained in the middle of her palm. She lifted her hand to her nose and sniffed. The drop of whatever it was smelled like nothing. Without thinking, she dipped her tongue in it and winced. It was sharp and cold, like licking a knife, and she shivered as she got back to her feet and ran to catch up with the hand. As they continued along the path, she looked at the sky, but there were no stars. It seemed close, too, like a dark blue blanket pulled over the top of a box. "Are we underground?" she asked the hand, then shook her head and added quickly, "I'm sorry. I keep forgetting you can't tell me anything. You can't even tell me where we're going. I hope you're taking me to someone who can. You're a nice hand, aren't you? I sure hope you are." She squinted at the landscape around her, hoping for the sight of something other than black sand and trees. At last the path reached a clearing, in the middle of which stood a long cabin, its windows glowing with orange firelight and a thin trail of smoke rising from its crooked chimney. The whole cabin looked like it was made of rock from the black mountain behind the forest. In spite of that, the orange light and sweet-smelling smoke made Sarah think it must be cozy and warm inside. The hand crossed the clearing and stopped outside the cabin, where it knocked on the door with its index finger, then stepped back, using its thumb to push Sarah onto the porch. "Hey," she said, "didn't anyone tell you it's not polite to push?" But the hand just blinked at her. She straightened her pajama top and faced the cabin door, which was open now. But no one was there. "Down here," a tiny voice said, and Sarah looked toward the floor, where she met the gaze of a fat black cat. "Did you say that?" she said. "You see anyone else?" the cat asked. Sarah giggled. She couldn't think of anything else to do. And then she realized she wasn't scared at all anymore. How could she be? This was the most amazing thing that had ever happened to her. "I hope you can tell me where I am," she said. The cat looked at the hand, then back at Sarah. He stepped toward her, sticking his nose in the air and sniffing. "You mean to tell me that you really don't know?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "I just hope it's not Penumbra." "What do you know about Penumbra?" "It's the place where all the souls of the dead go to sleep," Sarah said. The cat laughed a strange laugh, deep and rich. It seemed too big to be coming from a cat, even if he was sort of fat. "No, no, no," the cat said. "Who told you that?" "My mother," Sarah said sheepishly. "Well, your mother doesn't know what she's talking about." So penumbra isn't where the dead go to sleep? No. Is this penumbra? Wrong again. Then where am I? What is this place? Why, the cat purred. This is where shadows come from. I didn't know shadows came from anywhere. Oh, but they do, the cat said. Right here. Actually, from over there. He lifted a paw and pointed. That's where we grow them. It's called the Forest of Shadows. Sarah looked at the trees behind her, then faced the cat again. So that's what this place is called? The Forest of Shadows? The cat shook his head. Just over there. Everything together is called Scatopia. Oh, Sarah said. And who are you? My name is Balthazar, and I am the king of the cats. The king of the cats? Sarah said. I didn't know cats had a king. Then you're learning quite a lot tonight, aren't you? Why don't you come in and have some hot chocolate? You do like hot chocolate, don't you? I do, Sarah said. Good work, Lefty, Balthazar said to the hand. Now go make sure none of the sentinels followed you. The hand blinked. Thank you, Lefty, Sarah said. Glad to know the hand had a name. Goodbye. She waved at the hand, and it waved back, after which Sarah turned on her heels and went through the door into Balthazar's cabin. Chapter 8. The King of Cats. The inside of Balthazar's cabin was just as cozy as she had hoped it would be. The light felt even warmer and the smoke smelled even sweeter, like maple syrup. The place was filled with overstuffed furniture, the arms and cushions of which had been used for scratching so many times the stuffing poked through. A big bearskin rug lay on the dark wood floor in front of the fireplace. The dining table was set for 4, but there was a different dish at each place. At one was a plate of chicken, at another, salmon, at the third, milk, and at the fourth, a turkey leg. Sarah smiled as she took it in. Is this all for you? Of course, Balthazar said. You really are the king of the cats, aren't you? Would I make up something like that? Now sit down so we can talk. Sarah sat in a rocking chair by the fireplace, pulling herself toward the fire so she could warm up. But who does all this for you? His name is Jeb. Sarah nodded. Is he here now? Balthazar nodded, then jumped onto the hearth and came closer to Sarah, lowering his already tiny voice to a whisper. When he comes in, don't be afraid. He's not the nicest looking boy, but he's perfectly harmless. Sarah frowned. What do you mean by that? You'll see. Balthazar purred, then turned, snapping his tail. Jeb, he called out. A moment later, a door at the back of the cabin opened and a boy of about 13 stepped through quietly. At first, Sarah thought half his face was in shadow, but then she realized that it wasn't just in shadow. It wasn't there. Half of his face was gone. Sarah turned away, feeling as if she had seen something she shouldn't have. She felt Balthazar staring at her. 2 hot chocolates, Jeb, he said. I'd like marshmallows and whipped cream. He put a paw on Sarah's knee. How about you? Sarah looked at him. Oh, she said. Yes, please. The same. Jeb nodded and disappeared back the way he had come. So was I right? Balthazar asked. Or was I right? Even so, Sarah said. It's not his fault he's like that, isn't it? What's that supposed to mean? Just that it is his fault he looks like that. He lost half of his face in a bet. Sarah felt very confused. How can you bet your face? She asked. You can bet anything when you play with the blummies. What's a blummie? Sarah asked. Strange creatures, Balthazar said, with heads below their shoulders, in the middle of their chests. Terrible cheaters, too. I tried to tell Jeb that, but he wouldn't listen. Good thing he didn't play double or nothing. He said and laughed. Sarah suddenly felt very uncomfortable. There was something about Balthazar's attitude that bothered her. It was as if he thought he was better than everyone else, and he didn't try to hide it. Maybe that's the way it is when you're king, she thought, but I don't like it. That's not very nice of you, she said. Oh, you're right, of course, Balthazar said. I'm sorry. Do you forgive me? I suppose, Sarah said. She felt confused again. Now he seemed truly sorry. Good, Balthazar said, because I want us to be friends. Friends, Sarah said, surprised. How can we be friends? You haven't even asked me my name yet. Oh, dear, Balthazar said. You're right again. I don't know what's wrong with me tonight. I guess I'm just so excited to have a special visitor like you. One who's never been here before, I mean. Well, what's your name? Sarah. Sarah what? Sarah Marie Steiner. Very nice to meet you, Sarah. Nice to meet you, too, she said. The door at the back of the cabin opened again, and Jeb came through with a tray that held 2 white ceramic bowls filled with so much whipped cream and so many marshmallows. Sarah couldn't even see the hot chocolate. Sarah watched Jeb set one bowl on the hearth. The second he put on a low table next to the rocking chair. Thank you, she said. Jeb nodded, then turned to Balthazar. With this closer view, Sarah saw that the top of Jeb's head was normal, but the left side of his face was missing, just below his eyebrow all the way down to his chin. It occurred to her that what he looked like more than anything else was a jigsaw puzzle with a piece missing. She wondered if he could talk, with only half a mouth. That will be all for the moment, Jeb, Balthazar said. Sarah watched as Jeb went silently through the door again. When she turned back to Balthazar, he had buried his whole face in the whipped cream and was licking it up as fast as his pink tongue could go. Delicious, he said. Sarah gasped. What was she thinking? This had to be a dream. Giant hands and talking cats? A boy with only half a face? It was all simply too unreal. And as much as she wished it wasn't a dream, she was suddenly sure that at any moment she would find herself back in her bed with the bookcase in the wall and her mom standing over her telling her to wake up. Balthazar stopped eating his whipped cream and raised his head. For the first time, Sarah noticed that his eyes weren't like a normal cat's eyes. The pupils were round, like a human's. What's wrong? He asked. I was just thinking that maybe this is all a dream. I really hope it isn't. Oh, it's not, Balthazar said. Would you like me to prove it to you? Sarah nodded, and Balthazar suddenly shot one paw out and scratched her arm. Ow, Sarah said, pulling her arm away and rubbing it. What did you do that for? You wanted me to. To prove you're not dreaming. Now drink your hot chocolate and tell me where you came from and how you got here. Chapter 9. Quite a story. In between sips of what proved to be the best hot chocolate she had ever tasted, Sarah told Balthazar she was from California, but that her family had come to Pennsylvania because her grandma had died, and they were fixing up her house to sell it. She told him how she had discovered the secret room. Balthazar seemed especially interested when she told him about the basement and the big door she had seen behind the boiler, the one her mother had said went to Penumbra. Then he finished his hot chocolate and sat on the hearth, licking one paw and dragging it over his head and ears and mouth, purring the whole time. When Sarah finished, he stopped licking and looked at her. "Quite a story," he said. "You say your grandma used to live in the house?" "That's right." "I see," Balthazar said. "Well, it sure sounds like a nice place." "It is." She drank the last of her hot chocolate and smiled slowly as she wiped her mouth with her sleeve. "You should see it," she said dreamily. "I would very much like to," Balthazar said. "In fact, I was thinking that maybe you could take me home with you." Sarah's eyes widened. "Really? For real?" Balthazar nodded. "But what will you tell them?" "Who?" Sarah asked. "Your mother and father. What will you tell them about where I came from?" "I'll tell them you came from here, of course." In fact, she couldn't wait to tell them. She was sure that Mom would be relieved to discover that Grandma Winnie hadn't been making things up after all, and certainly was not crazy. This would prove it. Sarah was so excited that she decided she would even tell Billy about this place. "No, no, no," Balthazar said and laughed. "You can't tell them that." Sarah shook her head. "Why not?" "Because this is our secret." Balthazar jumped into her lap and then crawled onto her shoulders. He rubbed his body against her neck and lowered his voice to a whisper. "Imagine if you told your mom and dad about this place. First of all, they wouldn't believe you. You know how grown-ups are, don't you?" "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "They never believe anything kids say." "I guess so." "Furthermore," Balthazar said, purring again, "even if you proved Scatopia was real by bringing them here, what do you think they would want to do? Show it to all their friends?" Sarah said. Balthazar nodded. "And then what would happen?" He rubbed his black nose against her cheek. "Those friends would show their friends, and then it wouldn't be a secret anymore. They would form some kind of tourist company to bring even more grown-ups here on trips, and they would trample the forest and throw their trash in the stream, and it would be ruined." Sarah felt herself sagging. "I suppose you're right." Balthazar jumped to the floor and turned around, flicking his tail in a series of short jerks. "Of course I'm right. The king is always right. Don't you know that?" Sarah shrugged. "So the only way we can prevent such a catastrophe from happening is to keep this place a secret. To do that, you must tell your mother and father that you found me outside, hiding in the bushes, in spite of how undignified that will be for me, the king of the cats." Sarah sighed. "I can't tell anybody the truth, can I?" Balthazar shook his head. "That's what a secret is. But you're a talking cat. Not when anyone else is around, I won't be." "Ah," Sarah said, very disappointed. "Come now, you and I will still be able to talk. As long as we're alone." Sarah nodded. "Okay, but what about all this?" She waved her arm at the furniture and plates of food. "I won't be able to give you all of this." "Oh, I know that," Balthazar said. "This will still be here waiting for me when I come back. Jeb will take care of it." "You mean you're not going to stay with me?" No. I didn't mean that at all. I meant that Jeb will take care of the cabin until we come back to visit. Won't that be fun? Sarah nodded excitedly. The thought of having a place like Skitopia to visit any time she wanted, especially with her very own talking cat, was just too much. So when do you want to go? We have to wait until Lefty comes back, Balthazar said. Until then, would you please scratch my head? Sarah nodded, and as she rubbed her fingers through Balthazar's thick black fur, he purred with delight. After a few minutes, the door at the rear of the cabin opened and Jeb came in again. Balthazar twisted out from under Sarah's hand. Thank you, dear, he purred at her. As Jeb collected their empty hot chocolate bowls, Sarah caught his eye and their gazes locked for a long moment. His eye was as dry and dark as an empty bird bath, and as sad. Sarah's excitement was suddenly gone. She felt very bad for Jeb. It was the same feeling she got when she saw people who lived on the streets. She wanted to help him in some way, but she had no idea how. Before she had a chance to say thank you, he turned away quickly. As he rushed back to the door, Balthazar hopped down and followed him. Where are you going? Sarah asked and stood up. I'll be right back, Balthazar said. You wait there. Sarah sat down again. Balthazar jumped onto a long table near the door and said something she couldn't hear. Jeb stopped next to him. His shoulders sagged and he faced Balthazar. The cat looked at Sarah, then said something to Jeb in a hissing whisper. Jeb seemed upset by whatever Balthazar was telling him. All at once, Balthazar swatted Jeb's ear and hissed again. Sarah didn't know what was going on, but it didn't seem right for Balthazar to treat Jeb like that, even if the boy was his servant. She stood up, but before she could cross the room, there was a loud tapping at the door and Balthazar looked at her. Would you mind getting that for us, dear? He said. Sarah opened the door and saw Lefty standing on the porch. Oh, hi, Lefty, she said, and waved. The hand waved back and blinked at her. Do you want to come in? No, Balthazar said. I'm afraid he's not allowed inside. Sarah looked over and saw the cat running toward her. Behind him, Jeb stood with the tray in his hand, staring at her as if he desperately wanted to say something. But then he turned away and went through the door. You certainly have a lot of rules, Sarah said. That's part of what a king does. What were you saying to Jeb just now? She asked. I told him that I was going away and that he would have to take care of the cabin while I was gone. What did you swat him for? It's really none of your business. But since I want us to be friends, I'll tell you. I told him I was leaving and he said I couldn't. I simply had to remind him who makes the rules around here. Don't your mother and father spank you when you break their rules? No, Sarah said. No, they give us timeouts. Us. Me and my brother, Billy. Well, at least they have some sort of discipline. Balthazar faced Lefty. Well, is the coast clear? No sentinels. Lefty turned around and stepped down from the porch. Excellent, Balthazar said. He looked at Sarah. Are you ready to go? Shall we have Lefty take us back to where he found you? Sarah nodded and closed the door after Balthazar trotted past her. Together, the three of them stepped into the clearing and headed toward the forest. Chapter 10. Second Thoughts. So what's a sentinel? Sarah asked. They're like guards, Balthazar said. They patrol the forest and make sure that no one like you gets in. Your lucky Lefty found you before one of them did. You mean I'm not supposed to be here? That's right. Why not? For the same reason you can't tell your parents about this place. Because then it wouldn't be a secret anymore. What would they do if they caught me? Take you to the king, I suppose. Isn't that you? No, Balthazar said. I'm just the king of the cats. Even I have a king, the one who rules all of Scritopia. And that is who the sentinels would take you to. What's his name? Nobody knows. Where does he live? Nobody knows that either. Except the sentinels, I suppose. For everyone else, visiting the king of Scritopia is a one-way trip. Sarah felt a sudden tug of fear. Is that why you're scared of the sentinels? I'm not scared of the sentinels, Balthazar said, practically spitting the words. I just don't want our fun to be spoiled, that's all. If they caught me with you, we'd have double trouble. What do you mean? The breach is not to be crossed in either direction. I don't understand. Balthazar sighed. You aren't supposed to be here, and I am not supposed to go where you came from. But I won't let that stop me. Oh, Sarah said, and looked away from Balthazar into the shadow trees. She began to feel guilty and wondered if she should still let him come with her now that she knew it was against the rules. Trouble could mean punishment. She didn't like it when her parents punished her. And she certainly didn't like the sound of being punished by the king of Scritopia. Balthazar stopped and put his front paws on her knees. Don't tell me you're having second thoughts, he said. Well, Sarah said, looking down at him and twisting her hair the way she always did when she had a difficult decision to make. Balthazar dropped to all fours again. Aren't you the high and mighty one, he said, pacing back and forth in front of her, his tail flicking angrily. Didn't you tell me you weren't supposed to play in that secret room? And you did anyway, didn't you? Now that you've had your fun breaking the rules, you don't want to help me have my fun, is that it? No, Sarah said. It's not like that at all. She was trying to figure out a way to make sense of what she was feeling, but she knew Balthazar was right. She should have told her mom and dad about the secret room as soon as she found it. She knew she shouldn't have played in it without getting permission first. Now she was trapped. If she did the right thing and didn't take Balthazar with her, he would be very upset. But if she did take him with her, she would be breaking another rule, and she knew that might mean even more trouble down the road. So what is it then? Balthazar asked. Sarah looked down at him and knew at once that she simply could not pass up the chance to have a talking cat for a pet, no matter how many rules she had to break. She bent over and picked him up. You're coming with me, of course, she said. Bravo, Balthazar said. I knew you would make the right decision. Now, put me down, please. Sarah dropped him, and he shook out his fur. Shoo, he suddenly hissed, lifting his head as high as it would go. He sniffed at the air, the way he had when he'd first seen Sarah. What is it? She asked. Shoo, he hissed again. Sarah looked toward where he was sniffing and saw Lefty facing that way, too. A cool wind gusted through the trees, and as the shadow branches shifted, she saw a shape in the distance, white against the black, moving toward them. A sentinel, Balthazar whispered. He looked up at Sarah. We need to hide you quickly. But where? she asked. Lefty, down on the ground. Pretend you're asleep. Lefty did as he was told, dropping to his knees and rolling over so that his open palm faced the dark blue sky. Now get in, Balthazar said to Sarah. But be careful of his eye. Sarah crawled onto Lefty's giant palm. He closed his eye and she curled around it. Then he closed his fingers into a loose fist, surrounding her except for a small space near his thumb. Balthazar poked his head in. Everything will be fine as long as you stay quiet. I will, Sarah promised, and as Balthazar pulled his head back, she moved forward, pushing her face into the space, not only so she could breathe, but so she could see what was happening, too. The sentinel came down the path slowly, carrying something in his left hand. He looked like a normal man, Sarah thought, except for how pale his skin was. As he got closer, Sarah changed her mind. He wasn't normal after all. His chest and feet were bare, and his pants were made of some rough black fabric held up by a length of dark brown rope knotted around his waist. His head was bald, and his eyes and mouth were stitched shut with X's made of thick black thread. The object in his left hand was a head in a sling made of red rope. He carried it as if it were a lantern, holding it at arm's length in front of him. The head gave off no light, however. Its eyes and mouth were unstitched and open. Sarah wondered which one was the sentinel, the head in the sling or the body carrying it. For a moment, it looked like he was going to walk right past them, but then the head in the sling caught sight of Balthazar, and the body changed direction. The cat ran ahead to meet him,